Hello and welcome back to the Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. I'm Ambassador Philip Reeker, Chair of the Global Europe Program here at the Wilson Center, and today I'm delighted to welcome our special guest, Matteo Mecacci, Director of ODIHR, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Matteo, welcome back to Washington. I know you spent many years here as president of the International Campaign for Tibet prior to taking your current position, which is a very crucial position, if I may say. We've done some interesting programming and study of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. One of the key, shall we say, transatlantic institutions created in the post-World War II era to preserve an area of true peace and stability, which has led to great prosperity and opportunity for hundreds of millions, billions of people. OSCE, with its 57 participating states, includes all of the people of the former Soviet Union, as well as Mongolia, all of the European states, and transatlantic, of course, the United States and Canada. ODIHR is a well-known institution that focuses on the critical importance of democracy, the integrity of elections, rule of law, human rights, promotion of tolerance across the participating states, and as an example for the rest of the world. You have served for 3 years, going on 3.5, as director of this important organization. Let me start with talking about elections, because elections are very much on our mind,
of course,
particularly in 2024, the year of great elections. More elections, more people will go to the polls, go to vote around the world this year than ever before in history. ODIHR has been known for monitoring carefully and reporting on the integrity of elections. We just had, over this past weekend, elections across the European Union throughout its 27 member states to elect new members of the European Parliament, an institution that's perhaps not that well understood here in the United States or even in the EU itself. Those elections produced some interesting outcomes. Can you share with us, as the beginning of our conversation, your thoughts and observations on that process and the elections themselves?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for having me. Good to see you. And to be here at the Wilson Center is, yes, indeed. I mean, election observation is one of our main activities. And it was conceived, our organization was, created around 32 years ago, 32, 33 years ago. And it was after the end of the Cold War. And the idea was really to create institutions of which all these 57 members would be part of, to promote values, as you mentioned, rule of law, democracy, elections, tolerance and non-discrimination for all. And the idea is that every country is inviting the others to observe its own elections. So it's a sort also of a, confidence building measure.
Even in the United States.
Even in the United States.
We welcome OSCE, ODIHR observers.
And we have observed in the past for more than 20 years now, and there is also a plan in the future to continue to observe. And the idea is really so to try to build the confidence at the international level on, somehow holding each other accountable to the values of democracy that we have agreed at the international level. As you know, some of the UN documents and other international agreements put democracy as a key element also to ensure security.
The Helsinki Final Act, which created...
It's included among those. But also, of course, even more importantly, internally. Because the presence of election observers, neutral, independent election observers, can also be a confidence-building measure in countries where democracy has not been yet fully developed, to allow, for example, opposition, civil society groups to trust the system, to rely on some external check on what the authorities are doing. And as you know, when a government has been in power for a long time, it's very easy to try to take advantage of the position also to favor your own political parties. And this is always a struggle. So for the European Parliament, we have conducted an exercise which did not cover in detail, the election observation in 27 countries. It was a huge would have been a huge operation. But we had a team of people and experts who traveled to 20 of the 27 countries and came up with some assessment and recommendations, moving forward on how this form of what is truly, transnational democracy, because, the European Parliament has representatives of, 27 countries, and so many, political parties, hundreds of political parties are participating in these elections.
And those parties form coalitions.
Then, because
left,
mostly,
the right,
all countries are following for the European Parliament elections a proportional representation system. So, in any proportional system, basically, in order to form a governing coalition, you need to make to create a coalition and to make agreements with other parties. So, the outgoing Parliament had a majority which was comprised of the conservatives, the European People's Party, the socialists, and the liberal parties. And somehow, as you know, the outcome of the elections
broadly reflective of
more or less
the European political system.
Yeah.
But we're seeing in the news reports the outcome of these elections that there was a shift to the right in some cases in parts of the European Union. At the same time, you're reporting that the elections were, the integrity of these elections was what one should expect.
Exactly. They were elections generally competitive across the board, countries. Of course, every country has a different system, different government who are running, but I think there is a general assessment that, it was a very, of course, turnout was different also in different countries, on average it was 50%. So not the highest level for, let's say, European national elections. So what is interesting is that you have a bit less participation in European Parliament elections from the same nations, because there is still, I think, less ownership by the people of what happens in Brussels, while they have a stake what happens in Rome, in Spain, or in Madrid or in Berlin.
European colleagues often describe for me the European Parliament elections as similar to America midterm elections, the years in between presidential election years, which are somewhat of a barometer for what the voters are thinking. Turnout is often much lower, and it's a signal that then will direct, in the case of the European Parliament, the formation of the European Commission, which promulgates the regulation, the legislation that goes through the European Parliament, of course...
And which is also acquiring increasingly more powers,
yes.
Although, of course, the power of the purse mostly still at the national level, as we say, but there have been some decisions over the last few years, measures connected to the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it had on the national level. Some of the decisions were taken at Brussels by the European Commission were very instrumental to help many countries to cope with it, but also after the war in Ukraine. Some of the decisions that were taken to support not only Ukraine, but also to support national governments in dealing with the impact, sanctions and somehow reality is catching up, meaning that in order to be able also to survive at the national level, you need better alliances globally, and I think this is a reality that the world is facing, whether it's the United States, facing the relationship with China or Russia. I think Europe is heading towards the realization that we need a more structured approach to some of these topics.
Certainly that's been a theme for the Biden administration. President Biden has highlighted that America cannot do alone what perhaps it could in the past. We've just celebrated the 80th anniversary of D-Day, where American leadership was visible in terms of the brave efforts at Normandy that eventually retook Europe from Nazism, from fascism. Some suggest today that these types of challenges are re-emerging. In a sense, the world is a much more complicated place. The United States cannot do these things alone. We need our allies, and yet many suggest that democracy itself is under attack, is coming under great pressure due to technological change, due to things like the pandemic, due to the increasing wealth gap, as some would see it, even within our own societies and what we collectively talk about as the West. Although the OSCE space, of course, is much broader than that, and looks also to the south and to other parts of the globe. What are your thoughts as director of this Office for Democratic Institutions and for Human Rights on where we stand now after you've spent 3.5 years in this role?
Yeah.
Is there a concern about the future of democracy?
I think there is. I mean, democracy is a young experiment, in the history of humanity. And, you were mentioning Normandy and the anniversary, and, famously, Winston Churchill said, democracy is, the worst system except all others. So it's not a perfect system in itself, and because of the nature of people's participation, we have seen, even before World War II, even my own country, in Italy or in other European countries, were populist, and in the end, those who led to the authoritarian regimes, somehow they managed to win elections. So having a democracy is not a guarantee by itself that you will keep freedom and the respect of rule of law and human rights forever. So this is something that we have to remind ourselves. Democracies are resilient if they are able to deliver for the people, if the people feel, that they are, supported. So that is a challenge which is present.
Have a stake. And of course, the institutions that were created, some of them in the aftermath of World War II, including NATO, the European Union itself emerging to try to prevent the economic strains among European countries that had led to centuries of war and conflict. Woodrow Wilson himself, in the aftermath of World War I, had hoped to bring a more permanent peace. With the creation of OSCE, as you said, through the Helsinki Founding Act, which will soon have its 50th anniversary, created as the CSCE, which evolved into an organization after the end of the Cold War, and in 1994 in Budapest emerged the OSCE based in Vienna, the ODIHR as a part of OSCE based in Warsaw. These institutions themselves, which have helped preserve this peace and prosperity, are coming under increasing attack. And as we saw Putin's Russia attack fully Ukraine in a clear violation of all of the principles at the United Nations, at the OSCE, we've also seen Russia and others attack these institutions, OSCE, bring them to a very difficult point in terms of merely functioning, since the 57 participating states all have an equal role. It operates by consensus. How do you see the future of OSCE and by extension ODIHR in the months and years ahead?
It is a challenging situation, probably unprecedented, although this type of criticism or attacks, coming from a number of countries, you mentioned the Russian Federation, a few others, they are not new. They have been there for a while, but there has been also an understanding that, we are operating based on agreements which were reached by all 57, including those who are now critical. So the principle that we are applying about, democratic elections, respect for human rights, are not something that has been exported, or invented by some Western-led institutions. These were at the basis of the agreements, the OSCE. And I think this is so important to remember, because the OSCE has not been created as a like-minded group. It was an agreement between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Union with politically completely different systems.
Before anyone anticipated the end of the Cold War or the downfall of the Soviet Union.
So, in terms of the expectations, this is work that is done to try to bring countries closer. And I think we have been quite successful in the history. If you look at the history of Eastern Europe, if you look now at the situation, for example, that you follow very closely in the Western Balkans, the push for reforms, democracy, rule of law, human rights, etc., is gradually bringing these countries closer to having less corruption, less violence, less conflict, less wars, right? So investing in this type of diplomacy, which is, based on values, I think is still very, very important, even if there may be someone who says, what's the point of doing this now, after what happened in Ukraine? The international system and the trust has been broken, because if you choose war, then you cannot rely on the rules. I think we have to insist, even with the Russian Federation, even with countries which are very reluctant to apply this principle at the moment, that there is a commitment, and that is the way in which the international system and international relations should be built. We shouldn't give up to the idea that respect for human rights and democracy are somehow something additional to the how you manage geopolitics and security. They are an integral part if we don't want to go to an international system where the power of weapons becomes somehow the deciding factor in the relations.
As many have said, if the OSCE didn't exist, even now in 2024, when it's come under pressures where its functioning has been made more difficult, we would need to invent it. We have this structure. As with any institution, I think OSCE has learned to adapt and evolve, but remain true to its fundamental values, to the principles. And again, as you said, those principles were agreed to by all who signed up for this, including the then representatives in Moscow and the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation and other countries, some of which have human rights records that are not as enviable. You mentioned the Western Balkans, and indeed here at the Global Europe program at the Wilson Center, we have continued to focus on the Western Balkans, which emerged with the collapse of Yugoslavia at the end of the Cold War into a region of severe, in some cases, ethnic conflict, wars in Bosnia, in Kosovo. And we still don't see resolution of some of those. And some say, after 30 years, how is it possible that we don't have resolution? But this is the story of history. And in fact, I think there's a pretty good track record of making sure that war has not spread. Now, with war in Ukraine, some wonder, will the Western Balkans potentially be next? What's your broad observation or even more specific areas you choose to look at in terms of the Western Balkans? How is rule of law there in these countries, almost all of whom are on a path towards European Union membership? Many have become members of NATO, which shows a fundamental belief in a set of collective values. Is there progress in that region, the Western Balkans, which has so vexed European leaders for centuries? Or do you see a decline in this process?
I think there are two elements. One maybe is more of a political observation of what has happened over the last 20 years, I would say, because the last expansion of the European Union was around 2007 when the last Eastern European countries were brought in. And at the time, it was still, it was 2007. And there was, before, 2008 in Georgia and then Crimea, and so I think there was still this idea of expansion, of Europe. And then, also the Western Balkans were put on the map.
Croatia came in 2014, but other countries
the rest,
were kept
so
out.
I think there has been an expectation, from these countries and from the people of this country, most importantly, that this could happen, But we have seen that also in the European political system, not every country was so keen. So one of the consequences, I would say, that we have seen from the war in Ukraine has been a realization also by the vast majority, I would say, of political European leaders of the need to continue with the European project as a peace project. Because by having these countries to be part of the European Union, the geopolitical shift within Europe, because the Western Balkans actually they are in the heart of Europe. They are not
Sarajevo is less than 500 miles from Vienna.
Exactly, and we have seen that also with the opening of the accession. Is not for the Western Balkans, but discussion for Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia is a different maybe situation at the moment. So these, at the political level, I think we are in a moment where there is, I believe, an opportunity, to continue to support this project, which, and it comes back to my job, which is to support rule of law and democratic reforms, and with specific actually focus even there on elections. And so we have seen, with some up and downs, but in general, in this region, some of, for example, institutions that run the elections, the election management bodies, central election commissions, they are becoming more and more professional. Less
politicized,
and this is a very key component because who runs elections is very important to enjoy the trust of the people. Because if you go to vote, you want to make sure that your vote is not going to be stolen, it's not going to be messed with. So I think there, and of course every country is different. They have different paths. But there, I would say that there is some attempts to go into the right direction. But as we said before, these are countries that they did not have historically very strong independent institutions. And these things are not created in a short period. It takes time.
It doesn't happen in a news cycle. It doesn't happen in an election cycle.
And you could have a very good prime minister, exactly. But how do you make sure that then the institutions are going to continue whoever is in power? That is the key of democracy. That people can trust on the institutions. So our work is really to make sure that the judiciary becomes more independent, that the law is what is going to determine, how things are decided, for the people, whether it's about economy, businesses, etc. So, in general, I would say that there is a trend which is not negative, but at the same time, the pull factors and some of the exasperation or frustration of the people with the slow progress in this accession process is creating difficult situations in the countries where you see, for example, that the younger generation are moving, from Bosnia and Herzegovina to, Albania.
Brain drain.
Exactly. So these are challenges. If not addressed quickly, they could also put the country in a situation where they don't have the capacity to absorb also.
And these are generations that have become used to very fast change and very fast response, technology, absorbing and adapting to new ways of doing things, new formats of communication, uncertain formats, AI and what that means for understanding facts and validity, for the open space of disinformation. I think these are all areas that ODIHR will have to address in the future.
And they are very critical because they, of course, when there are these opportunities for people to participate, and we have recently observed, for example, elections in Serbia, both last December, where there were also some protests, from the opposition, and now more recently there was once again the local elections in Belgrade and in other places.
Which were rerun, I believe.
They were rerun because they could not find a political agreement. So, technically it was just for lack of a majority, but there was also a push to continue. But in this situation, for example, part of the opposition decided to boycott the participation in elections. And we have seen this in the Western Balkans, in Albania, a few years ago. The same. So when there's no trust at the political level between the majority and the opposition, that is a sign that can be concerning because it sends a signal to the citizens that you should not trust the institution, you should not participate, etc. So, of course, every politician is free to make a decision on how to handle politically these, but these are, signs that can be, that needs to be addressed because they can lead to further dissatisfaction and maybe to the idea of more populist approach, which,
This is an important theme, I think, because we've created these institutions and for people to maintain their trust in them, they need to know and understand these institutions and how they've played a critical role in security, ultimately prosperity, in certainly the transatlantic space, but as OSCE and ODIHR demonstrate, beyond that space with a global impact in a time of great uncertainty and technological change.
Yeah.
Some have compared this, as we touched on a little earlier, with countries like Italy a century ago. In the 1920s, the 1930s, the emergence of fascism, of Mussolini. You're a Juris Doctor from the University of Firenze, of Florence, one of the great institutions of learning from the Renaissance on forward. How do you think ODIHR and OSCE can approach these kinds of reactions and avoid a recurrence of what we saw a century ago?
Yeah, it's a big challenge, I think, for everyone. But I think what is very important is that whenever in a country there is a danger of lack of trust in democratic institutions, or the temptation of someone maybe who's ruling to become more authoritarian, and slowly eroding the rule of law, making some restrictions which may not appear immediately as dramatic, not a coup d'etat, not suspending the constitution, but having a trusted international institutions that is speaking on behalf of everyone, but not, of a specific country. So it's not Washington, it's not Berlin, but it is the institution representing everyone, including their own country. I think that's an important check for the country, for the citizens, and sometimes for civil society organizations or for opposition movement who need, to have some validation to their own concerns. Yeah. And then they can use some of the mechanism, whether it's ODIHR or it could be the European Court on Human Rights, or we have seen, for example, in Poland, that the European Commission, over the last few years, they opened a proceeding about rule of law violations. And that led at some point to the suspension of the funding of certain projects in Poland.
Tangible
impact
pressure
of, and of course, that's not what we do, but some of our legal opinions were used by the European Commission, as part of the decision-making process. So having these type of institutions which are seen and perceived as professional and independent, it's very important to help avoid that when you have some crisis in the democratic system, it doesn't fall off the cliff. That the people can resort to some international and, if the local institutions are not able to address those,
Checks and balances is what our founding fathers, the founders of the United States, this great democracy, underscored. After such a period of fascism, of disruption, of horrific war and suffering, we sought to create a better world and use the Euro-Atlantic model to help others understand how to do it. It is a time of great change, of many elections, and here at the Wilson Center, as we look at Europe and its role globally, including the European security architecture and the institutions that are part of that, we will continue to follow these. We're very grateful, Matteo Mecacci, to have you with us today. We thank you, and we thank ODIHR for the great work you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. We look forward to welcoming you back to the Global Europe program at the Wilson Center. Goodbye.